In 1615, a 14-year-old princess was brought before a room full of strangers and ordered to submit to a physical inspection. Midwives examined her body while priests watched from the corner, scribbling notes. Courtiers whispered behind their hands, and the girl just stood there shaking because this was the price of becoming a queen. Her name was Anne of Austria. In the morning after her wedding to King Louis I, 13th of France, his own mother marched into the bedchamber, pulled back the sheets, and inspected them for stains. That was considered normal, expected even, because for centuries across Europe, a princess's most valuable possession was not her intelligence, not her political skill, not her bloodline. It was proof of her purity. And entire kingdoms rose and fell based on whether or not that proof could be confirmed. This is the story of how queens, princesses, and empresses were subjected to the most degrading ritual ever invented, and how that ritual destroyed marriages, triggered wars, and sent innocent women to their deaths. The commodity of purity. To understand why kings and clergy were so obsessed with inspecting teenage girls, you need to understand one thing about medieval Europe. Marriage was not about love. It was a business transaction, and the bride was the product. When a king arranged a marriage for his daughter, he was selling a guarantee. That guarantee was simple. This girl has never been touched by another man, which means the children she produces will carry your blood, and your blood alone. No disputed heirs. No questions about who fathered the prince. A clean, unbroken line of succession. And the proof of that guarantee, a single physical sign so unreliable it could disappear from horseback riding. That physical sign became the seal on a political contract worth millions. And just like any expensive product, buyers demanded verification before closing the deal. But the methods they used to verify it were far more disturbing than you might expect. The most common approach was a physical examination performed by midwives. 2 or 3 of these women were summoned to the princess's chamber days before the wedding. The girl would undress, lie on a table, and submit to an invasive inspection. A single word from these midwives could make or break a royal marriage. But that was actually the rational part, because medieval doctors believed they had far more creative ways to detect purity, and every single one of them was completely insane. A 13th century medical text, called Discritus, Mulierum claimed that a maiden's urine was clear and sparkling, while a woman who had known a man produced cloudy urine. Physicians collected samples, held them up to candlelight, and delivered verdicts that determined whether a princess would become a queen or be sent home in disgrace. Real doctors, real urine, real political consequences, and absolutely zero science behind any of it. But even that was not the strangest test. Over in ancient Greece, the historian Hannah Blank documented a belief that purity could be read from the shape and color of a woman's upper body. Physicians would examine a bride's appearance, compare it against a set of criteria that had been invented out of thin air, and announce whether she passed or failed. A woman could be completely untouched and fail because her body simply looked different than what a Greek doctor expected. And a woman with a past could sail through with flying colors. The entire system was built on a lie, but nobody in power had any reason to question it because the lie gave them exactly what they wanted: control. Now, you would think that passing this examination would be enough, that once the midwives signed off, the princess could breathe. But that was only half of the humiliation, because what happened on the wedding night was somehow even worse. The bedding ceremony. Even after a princess passed the purity examination, she still had to prove it again, and this time she had an audience. It was called the bedding ceremony, and for roughly 500 years, it was standard practice at royal weddings across Europe. Once the wedding feast ended, the bride and groom were escorted to their bedchamber by a crowd of family members, friends, courtiers, and clergy. A bishop or priest would bless the marriage bed. Attendants helped the couple prepare for the evening. Bridesmaids and groomsmen sat on either side of the bed, throwing stockings at the newlyweds in a tradition that supposedly predicted who among them would marry next. Then the curtains around the bed were drawn and the couple was left alone. Sometimes, because in many Mediterranean cultures, the morning after was treated as a public spectacle. The sheets were pulled from the bed and inspected for evidence of the bride's purity. The right stains meant the bride had come to the marriage untouched. Clean sheets meant she had not, and that alone could trigger a political crisis that reached across borders. But the inspection was not always kept behind closed doors. In parts of Spain, Greece, and the Balkans, Those sheets were hung from windows for the whole city to see, placed on platters, and paraded through the streets. The groom's mother often served as the lead inspector, holding up the evidence like a trophy while neighbors cheered. Over in Bulgaria and Cyprus, the groom would fire a gun to announce the good news to the entire village. And that still was not the worst of it, because in some royal households, witnesses did not even leave the room during the wedding night itself. The marriage of King William III and Mary Seguna of England in 1677 was observed by her uncle, King Charles II, who reportedly shouted encouragement and advice from the foot of the bed, her uncle in the room watching, giving instructions. That was the life of a royal bride. But the part that made the whole system collapse under its own logic is this. Many women show no physical evidence on their wedding night, regardless of their history. Some women are born without the expected signs entirely. Others lose them through physical activity like horseback riding or manual labor, both of which were common in the medieval world. A woman could be completely untouched and still fail the test. And a woman with a past could easily pass it. Medieval women figured this out long before the men did. And what they did about it was equal parts brilliant and desperate. How women fought back. The most detailed survival guide came from a medieval medical text called and it reads like a manual for high-stakes deception. One recipe instructed brides to take egg whites, mix them with water boiled with certain herbs, soak a linen cloth in the mixture, and use it before the wedding night. The goal was to create the physical resistance that inspectors expected to find. The trot described the process in clinical detail, step by step, ingredient by ingredient, as if it were a recipe for bread instead of a formula for saving a woman's life, because that is exactly what it was. A woman who failed the wedding night test did not just lose her marriage. She lost her reputation, her family's honor, and in some cases, her head. But the Tratula was a rare book passed between women in secret, and most brides never saw a copy in their lives. So what happened to the women who had no recipe, no herbs, and no time to prepare? They improvised, and the method they came up with was so simple it is almost hard to believe it worked for centuries. A bride could hide a small vial of animal blood in a piece of jewelry or beneath the bedsheets. Most medieval households had adjoining farms where animals were butchered regularly, so getting hold of a vial was easy enough. Under the cover of darkness, a quick spill at the right moment, and the groom would be completely fooled. This method required no herbs, no preparation, and no medical knowledge, just nerve. And women across Europe used it for centuries. Then there was the option that sounds like it belongs in a spy novel, but it actually appears in multiple historical and literary sources from the period. According to Kathleen Coyne Kelly's research, some brides arranged for a different woman to secretly take the bride's place in the darkened bedchamber. The wedding night happened. The evidence was produced, and nobody knew the difference. The real bride would then appear the next morning as if nothing had happened. This switch shows up in medieval romances and legal texts alike, which tells you it was not just fiction. It was common enough that people were writing laws about it. These tricks saved countless common women and lower nobility from ruin. But for princesses and queens, none of it mattered. The stakes were too high and the scrutiny too intense for any deception. Their bodies were inspected by professionals. Their wedding nights were observed by witnesses. And if anything seemed off, the consequences were not embarrassment or gossip. They were catastrophic. How catastrophic? One princess's wedding night triggered a chain of events that split Christianity in half and killed thousands of people when the test decided the fate of nations. No story illustrates the political weight of purity better than the marriage of Catherine of Aragon, and this one changed the course of Western civilization. In 1501, Catherine, the youngest daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, married Prince Arthur of England. Both were 15. The wedding was a massive diplomatic event, binding the royal houses of Spain and England in an alliance worth a fortune. On the morning after their wedding night, Arthur reportedly called for his servant, Sir Anthony Willoughby, and told him to bring a cup of ale, because he had been this night in the midst of Spain. Later that day, the young prince boasted to his attendants that it is good pastime to have a wife. 5 months later, Arthur was dead, and that is when the question that would reshape English history was born. Had the marriage been fulfilled? Was Catherine still pure? Because the answer to that question was not just personal. It was worth a kingdom. If Catherine was no longer untouched, she was Arthur's widow in every legal and biblical sense. Marrying her to Arthur's younger brother, the future Henry VIII, would require a special papal dispensation, since the book of Leviticus forbade a man from marrying his brother's wife. Catherine swore on her immortal soul that the marriage had never been fulfilled, that Arthur had been too sick, too young, that she remained as she had come to England, completely untouched. Her mother, Queen Isabella, sensed danger even then. She pushed the Pope to grant a dispensation valid regardless of whether the marriage had been fulfilled or not. It was a legal safety net designed to protect her daughter from exactly the kind of challenge that might come decades later. The Pope agreed. Catherine married Henry in 1509, and for nearly 20 years, the safety net held. Nobody questioned it. Nobody? That it. But safety nets have a way of unraveling when the person holding the scissors is also the King of England. Henry wanted a son. Catherine could no longer bear children, and a woman named Anne Boleyn had caught the king's attention. Suddenly that wedding night from 1501 mattered more than anything else in England, more than treaties, more than alliances, more than the Pope himself. So Henry did something no English king had ever done before. He put his own wife on trial. He dragged Catherine before a court at Blackfriars in 1529 and demanded she admit the truth. Had the marriage to his brother been real or not? The entire English Reformation, the break from Rome, the creation of the Church of England, all of it hinged on what had happened between two teenagers 28 years earlier. Catherine did not crumble. She knelt before her husband, looked him directly in the eye, and delivered the speech of her life. She told the court that when Henry first took her as his wife, she had been completely untouched, and she put it to his conscience whether or not he knew that to be true. The room went silent. Every courtier, every bishop, every ambassador waited for Henry to deny it. He never answered. Not publicly, anyway. What followed reads, like dominoes falling across a continent. Henry annulled the marriage, married Anne Boleyn, broke from the Catholic Church, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, executed those who disagreed. The monasteries were dissolved. Religious wars consumed Europe for the next century. Thousands died. Every single thread traces back to a question about a princess's purity on her wedding night in 1501. But Henry was far from finished with his obsession, and the women who came after Catherine paid an even higher price. The king, who judged his wives. Henry VIII did not just use purity as a political tool. He used it as a weapon against the very women who shared his bed. When he married his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, in January 1540, Henry was expecting the beauty from a Hans Holbein portrait. What arrived instead was a tall, strong-featured German princess who did not match the flattering image. From the moment he saw her, the king was disgusted, reportedly telling Thomas Cromwell, "I like her not." The morning after their wedding night, the complaints poured out. He told Cromwell he had touched Anne and found her nothing fair with a figure that suggested impurity. Based on this inspection alone, he declared she could not have come to him untouched. Her appearance, he claimed, had the look of a woman who had already borne children. 4 nights, Henry attempted to fulfill the marriage. 4 nights he failed, and 4 nights he blamed Anne for his own inability to perform, even though his physician quietly noted that the king showed no such difficulty during sleep. The failure was entirely his, but the blame fell completely on her. And what makes this story even worse is the detail that came out afterward, because Anne had received so little education about what happened between a husband and wife that she genuinely believed the marriage was being fulfilled. When her ladies-in-waiting carefully asked about her relationship with the king, Anne stunned them. She said Henry kissed her hand each night and said goodnight, then kissed her again in the morning and said farewell. She told Lady Roford, "Is this not enough? When he comes to bed, he kisses me and takes me by the hand and bids me good night. I am content with this." Her ladies gently explained what actually happened between married people. Anne was shocked. Word spread through the court like fire, and Henry became a laughingstock. The marriage was annulled after 6 months. Anne of Cleves was one of the lucky ones. She agreed to the annulment, received a generous settlement, including Hever Castle and Richmond Palace, and lived comfortably in England as the king's beloved sister. She outlived Henry, outlived his son Edward, and died peacefully in 1557. But here's the thing about Henry's obsession. It did not just humiliate women. It killed team, and the woman who came next proved that in the worst way possible. Catherine Howard was Henry's fifth wife, young, lively, full of energy, but also a teenager who came to the marriage with a past. Growing up in the crowded, unsupervised household of her step-grandmother, the Dea, Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine had been involved with a music teacher named Henry Manick and a young courtier named Francis Dar. For a girl raised in those circumstances, none of this was unusual. But when these relationships surfaced after Catherine's wedding to the king, they were not treated as youthful mistakes. They were treated as treason. Think about that for a moment. Not scandal, not embarrassment. Treason. A capital crime that carried the death penalty. And the girl at the center of it all had never asked for any of this. Catherine had not chosen to marry the king. She had not chosen to grow up in a household where nobody watched out for her. She had not chosen to be uneducated about the expectations placed on a queen. She was a teenager who liked music and dancing and pretty clothes, and the adults around her had put her in a position she was never equipped to handle. None of that mattered. She had failed the purity standard, and for that she was sentenced to die. On the night before her execution, Catherine asked for the block to be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head on it. She wanted to die with dignity, because that was the only thing she had left. On the morning of February 13th, 1542, she was led to the Tower of London. She knelt, placed her neck on the wood, and the sentence was carried out. All because she failed the purity standard. The mother who checked the sheets. The French royal court produced its own version of this horror, and in some ways it was even more suffocating than what happened in England. When Anne of Austria married King Louis I, 13th in 1615, both were 14 years old. According to historical accounts, Louis had to be physically carried to the wedding bed, because the boy could barely function under the weight of what was expected of him. 2 nurses stayed in the room during the wedding night to make sure everything was completed. The following morning, his mother, Marie de Medici, the Queen Regent, personally entered the bedchamber and inspected the sheets for evidence of the union. The nurses assured her the marriage had been completed twice. So far, so successful. The dynasty had its heir in progress. The alliance was sealed. Everyone could relax. Except that is not what happened. Not even close. After that wedding, Louis never returned to Anne's bed. Not for weeks, not for months, not for 4 years. And nobody at court could figure out why. Some whispered that Louis preferred the company of his male favorites. Others said his traumatic wedding night had broken something in him that could not be repaired. Whatever the reason. The entire French court watched Anne's waistline for signs of pregnancy that never came. 23 years of whispers, suspicion, and daily humiliation. All traced back to 2 traumatized teenagers forced to perform for an audience before they even understood what are happening. And France was far from the worst offender. In medieval Iceland, a marriage was only legally valid if the bedding ritual was witnessed by at least 6 men. 6 men in the room watching, confirming the contract was sealed. In ancient Greece, maidens sang loudly outside the bridal chamber to drown out the cries of the bride during her first night as a wife. They were not singing in celebration. They were covering up her pain. You would think that eventually humanity would move past all of this. That the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, the rise of modern science would have killed this obsession once and for all. But it did not. Not even close. The obsession that refused to die. When Napoleon Bonaparte married Josephine in 1796, his family despised her. Not because she was a widow. Not because she was 6 years older than him. Because she had been with another man before Napoleon, and his mother, Laetitia, never let her forget it. The same purity politics that had consumed the Tutor and the Bourbons were alive and well in revolutionary France, more than 200 years after Catherine Howard went to the block, and the obsession kept going. In 1840, when Queen Victoria married Prince Albert, she wore a white wedding dress that became the global symbol of bridal purity. Before Victoria, brides wore whatever color they wanted. After Victoria, white meant one thing only, and every woman who walked down the aisle in a white dress was making a statement about her body, whether she wanted to or not. By the 20th century, The purity test had traded the royal bedchamber for the medical clinic, but the logic behind it had not changed at all. In 2018, the World Health Organization, UN Women, and the United Nations Human Rights Council jointly called for a global ban on purity testing. They called it painful, humiliating, and a form of violence against women. They had to make that statement because the practice is still happening. In parts of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, girls are still subjected to the same examinations that medieval princesses endured. In 2022, the Supreme Court of India ruled that anyone conducting invasive purity examinations on a woman would be guilty of misconduct because medical professionals were still performing them. The obsession that once toppled the English crown, that once determined whether a 14-year-old French queen would keep her title, that once sent Catherine Howard to the executioner's block as a teenager, that obsession never fully disappeared. It just moved out of the palace and into the clinic. For thousands of years, women's bodies were treated as property to be inspected, verified, and stamped with approval before they could be transferred from one man to another. Fathers sold the guarantee. Midwives verified it. Priests blessed it. Kings enforced it, and women survived it. The only way they could. Some survived by playing the game, hiding vials of animal blood under the sheets, timing their weddings to their cycles, memorizing recipes from the trot like their lives depended on it. Because sometimes they genuinely did. Others survived through sheer force of will, like Catherine of Aragon, who swore to her dying breath that she had come to Henry untouched and dared the King of England to prove otherwise. And some did not survive at all. Catherine Howard went to the block. Countless unnamed women throughout history were cast out, divorced, publicly shamed, or killed, all because a physical sign with no medical relevance was treated as the most valuable thing a woman could possess. The purity test was never about virtue. It was about control. It was about making sure that women, even queens and empresses, understood that their bodies did not belong to them, that their worth was measured not by what they could do, but by what had been done to them. And for centuries, nobody questioned it. Catherine Howard practiced on the block the night before she died. Catherine of Aragon saw her innocence with her final breath. Anne of Austria waited 23 years in silence. Every one of them paid a price for a test that proved nothing. If this story stayed with you, the one about the women who were buried alive for breaking a vow of chastity in ancient Rome is even darker. That video is on screen right now, and if you made it to the end, subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered.